Our next question, Jim, was sent in on Twitter using the hashtag CornyDriveThru from Sean McCarty. I was watching the Ric Flair Jerry Lawler August 14th, 1982 match in Memphis. Why was the angle dropped in the coming weeks? I heard the rematch was nixed due to a Lawler-Jarrett dispute. Could you shed your effervescent light on the situation? And even if Flair never returned to Memphis, couldn't the angle have been altered in some way rather than what seemed like sweeping it under the rug?
Well, the reason why they swept it under the rug was because they needed to sweep it under the rug because they were about to bring Bockwinkel in. See, I can't remember all the specifics, but we ought to have Randy Hales or somebody on that can recount the whole thing. But basically, Jarrett and Lawler thought that they had a deal that would get Flair to come back to the Coliseum and maybe even a short-term title switch. I don't fucking know. But something happened to change the arrangement. I don't think between Lawler and Jarrett. I think between Jarrett and Lawler and the NWA, or maybe not even Flair personally. I can't remember. But the point is, that was August of 82, right? August 14th. I remember that because I was there shooting pictures of the match, and that's when Jerry Jarrett tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, you want to be a manager, kid? Come back next week with a fucking suit." So I definitely remember that day, but by Christmas time, Lawler was going for the AWA title, and that's where they did the disputed thing, and he actually did win it in Memphis for 2 weeks. And it's so they just picked up with the AWA title where the NWA title was. So they swept the NWA title picture under the rug because they were turning around 3 months later expecting people to believe that the AWA belt was the number one title. So they just got away from it. But there was something that they were convinced that they had, whether it was a short-term disputed switch, something or other. That's the way they started it. The bounty was going to be a takeoff on Jarrett's original angle with Lawler was the march to the title, where he brought in all these guys that were in the top 10 in the wrestling magazines, and Lawler would get some kind of disputed win, right? And finally gets a world title shot. Well, it only made sense that the champion would come in. Lawler would, Flair in this case, Lawler would almost beat him, go to the draw, and then he'd run off. And then he'd write Jimmy Hart a check for $25,000, get rid of Lawler by the time I come back. And then they'd bring in all the names to try to collect the bounty. And then finally Flair would have to come back. Whatever the fuck happened after the first couple of weeks that changed things, they just said, fuck it. But that's the way that it would have gone. And, once again, I got to be honest with you. I think it was better long-term business that they didn't pursue the NWA thing and instead went with Bockwinkel and the AWA title. Bockwinkel and Lawler had better matches than Flair and Lawler did. Bockwinkel was available more often, so he could come back in. You could not only work Memphis, but work Louisville and sometimes even Evansville. You could do programs with him because Vern ran a part-time schedule, and even though he paid full-time money, that's why Bockwinkel never left the AWA. He told me that himself. I took him to dinner. When he'd come to Louisville, I'd take him to the hotel and take him out to eat and pick his brain, right? He was in the late 70s, early 80s, he was making $150,000 a year, working an average of 15 days a month. He didn't want the NWA title. Do the math on that with today's money, right? Plus, in most of the summers, they were off because people like to go outdoors up in that part of the country. So they had great quality of life. Anyway, Bockwinkel came in, had much better matches, was more available, and did the great promos. And he was willing to let Lawler call the match because Bockwinkel said Lawler's the best ring general I've ever been in a ring with. He knows for his audience how to call his match. Whereas with Rick and Lawler, Rick wanted to do his shit. Because he was like, I'm Ric Flair, I'm, the champion. Lawler's a top guy in Memphis. But, anyway, all the way better around, and they got mileage out of Lawler and Bockwinkel for the next 3 years till Bockwinkel retired.
realistically, taking personal feelings out of it, if you were the NWA, would you have trusted Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett with the belt?
Well, no. Well, not that I wouldn't have trusted them. I would not have put here's the thing. Jerry Lawler, in my opinion, was a better performer all around than many people who held the NWA title, to be quite honest.
I agree.
But he was not, nor would he ever have wanted to been, the traveling world champion that the NWA needed. He wasn't going to go to all those territories because it would have put Memphis out of business. They've spent 1 year without Lawler and fucking almost went out of business. It was the worst business of a 15-year period, the year they went without Lawler when he broke his leg. He wasn't going to leave and leave his territory that long. He also was not going to be immediately over in so many of those different territories that he'd never been to before. That's why they used to send the prospective next champion to St. Louis and to Florida and to the here and there to get him over ahead of time. But Lawler was painted into a picture and into a corner, and so was Jarrett, in that he was so over in the Memphis territory. He had been fighting for the world title, coming up short so many times, even though they got creative with it. Whether he goes to an hour Broadway with the champion, and then he gets a rematch with a 90-minute time limit, but Jimmy Valiant runs in and breaks a bottle over his head and stabs him and sends him to the hospital. Well, okay, so that takes us in a different direction for a while. But after a number of years, they felt the people would get frustrated if he never won it. So what they were looking for was what they got with the AWA, which was a disputed type of win where he could win it in Memphis. It didn't have to be recognized everywhere else. Maybe it could be held up for a couple weeks. Some other way out besides not winning the title again, because at the time in 1982, for the previous 9 years, Jerry Lawler had been the number one box office attraction in the territory. And for 8 of those years, he'd been going after the world title. Not only was he the top box office attraction in the territory on an ongoing basis, he was more important to Memphis than I think probably any wrestler was to their territory in that period of time. Maybe, Heenan in Indianapolis a little bit earlier. He was more important than even to Dusty in Florida, because Florida still had the Briscoes and the Funks and Eddie Graham. And they had tons of main event talent, even though Dusty was the man. But to lose Lawler, or to diminish his stature in the fans' eyes by him repeatedly coming up short, they had to keep coming up with creative ways to get the belt on him for a second, or to really make sure the people knew he'd been screwed out of it and he should be the champion.